Good morning and welcome to the next session of this very beautiful morning here in Delphi. As you've already seen, our topic of discussion is about the future of transatlantic defense cooperation, assessing opportunities and challenges for deepening US and EU collaboration in the coming years. Here we have Mr. Jonathan Hoyle, the Vice President and Chief Executive Europe of Lockheed Martin, Philip Kosnett, the retired U.S. Ambassador from the Kosnett Associates LLC, the Director of the Defense Integrated Planning Directorate of the Ministry of National Defense of Romania, Șerban Lungu, and the former Minister of the National Defense of Hellenic Republic, Mr. Alkiviadis Stefanis, the General Stefanis. Those of you who have followed through the previous discussions, you may have seen that we've already had some discussion about what exactly does the US-EU cooperation or collaboration, you name it, means in terms of concrete terms. I will start with Mr. Hoyle, who represents, I would say, a giant in terms of not only in volume of sales, but the broad array of the products they manufacture for defense industries around the world. And I would start with a simple question, since you have that experience, is how these defense industries, US and EU defense industries, can work together. We've already discussed about fragmentation, especially in the European side. So based on your experience, I would like some hints towards that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Vassilis, and thank you for being here. It's good to be back in Greece again. I'll start with three challenges that I think both sides of the Atlantic industries face. One is being driven by events in Ukraine. The second has arisen from COVID. And the third, which the last panel and indeed the first panel touched on, is the pace and speed of technological change that is occurring across not only our business, but more particularly the commercial sector. And I think on the last one, what we are seeing in the commercial sector is companies, the big companies, by which I mean the Googles, the Microsofts, the Nvidias, spending about 10 times the volume of money on R&D that the defense sector spends. So not surprisingly, we are seeing a massive adaptation of commercial industry applications in the war in Ukraine. And the defense sector is never going to match those volumes. So I think one challenge for in the defense industry is how we embrace those commercial firms who operate at a much different speed. They're far more agile, they adapt technologies much earlier than is typical in defense. How do European and American defense firms embrace that? And I think one of the challenges for the European companies is the big volume of that expenditure and the big volume of the drive of that technological change comes from typically the west coast of the United States. So how do we embrace that combined as an industry and not separate the two sides? On COVID, I think what COVID has shown to us is that our supply chains are very fragile. And subject to disruption in ways that we hadn't previously imagined. And we have to thicken the resilience of our supply chains. That means we need to find more suppliers. That presents an opportunity for industries on both sides of the pond to embrace. I think for many, many years, people like me in my former life as a bureaucrat tried to squeeze money out of defense budgets by making just-in-time logistics chains, single suppliers, and COVID demonstrated to us that that was a big flaw. And therefore we have to find new suppliers. So there are plenty of opportunities for the combined industry to work on there. And thirdly, on Ukraine, I think one lesson from Ukraine, there are many lessons. One is volume still matters. And again, we have operated for the last 30 years on small production cycles with small volume buys because we didn't think we were going to use volume. And the ability to ramp up production, our inability to ramp up production at speed has come as something of a surprise to many ministers that I engage with. They think we could turn a knob and double production of this equipment and that equipment. But when on something like an F-35 you have 1,600 suppliers, you are dependent on the smallest, most fragile supplier to be able to change production volumes. It is not necessarily the big giants, as you referred to it, corporations. It's the small guys who have to go to a bank to get a loan to invest. And they can only get a loan from a bank if they've got a contract. So we have to think through, and I'm pleased to see that the European Investment Bank was on a panel earlier. We have to work with that community so that the supply chain gets strengthened to enable volume increase. And I think those challenges apply both sides of the pond. And I think we have to work together because we can't solve them separately. They are a global challenge that impacts allies in the Far East, as well as Europe, as well as North America.
Well, thank you for this. I'm now going to turn to Ambassador Kosnett. And, the transatlantic cooperation is also has some big political question marks to be answered. And since we are in an election year in the United States, I would like to ask you if you think that potential, change in the White House could possibly also affect US and the EU integration on the defense level as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll answer that question, and then I'd like to talk about the implications of it a little bit. So, first of all, I think that the question of America's political future is more complicated than whether or not there'll be a Democratic or Republican president in the White House a year from now. American politics is a very complicated stage. I mean, one element of that is that within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, we've seen an increase in factionalism, which affects security policy and attitudes towards cooperation in Europe. I think most of the people in this room are aware that the Republican Party is suffering from factionalism, a divide between neo-isolationism and people who are still committed to the defense of Europe, the defense of Ukraine, of close cooperation with our traditional allies. But within the Democratic Party as well, there's been an increase in factionalism between the traditional centrist elements of the Democratic Party and the so-called progressive wing. And due to the vagaries of the American political system, the question of providing additional assistance for Ukraine is connected with the question of whether we should be providing additional military assistance to Israel. And a significant number of Democratic representatives are opposed to us providing additional aid to Israel at this moment due to the nature of the conflict in Gaza, and that has affected the ability of the Democratic Party to support Ukraine. Now, there are many, many possible scenarios. I suppose the worst case scenario for Europe is one in which there is a red wave in the November election. Republicans control both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the White House and the isolationist wing of the Republican Party takes control. The absolute worst case scenario, which until recently was the province of science fiction authors, is an American withdrawal from NATO. Now, personally, I think that is exceptionally unlikely to occur, but it's always important to at least think about the worst case scenario. But even in the best case scenario, where the United States remains committed to NATO, remains committed to supporting Ukraine and helping our European partners to rebuild their security, even in that case, Europe is going to face the sort of challenges we've been discussing throughout the forum of doing more and doing more quickly. So I don't see a scenario where Europeans can say, oh, well, everything is back to the way it used to be. The Americans are taking care of Europe's defense. We don't need to worry about it anymore. Okay. In terms of implications, Jonathan has already touched on the difficulty of rapidly increasing defense industrial production. It's a very important element. Beyond that, I think it's important for everyone to remember that there is much more to building a capable military than just counting rifles, counting tanks, counting aircraft. A military needs to have manpower. It needs to have the ability either to recruit or to conscript adequate numbers of personnel. It needs to be able to produce, or a country needs to be able to produce or purchase adequate weapons. And the point that Jonathan made about the importance of mass, of quantity, is critical. I think it was Napoleon who said that morale is as the material in war by a factor of 3 to 1. And I think that refers not just to the morale of the military, but to national morale, to national will. There has to be will on the part of governments, democratically elected governments, to take on the difficult challenges, not just to build a military, but to deploy that military, to put their young men and women in harm's way if it comes to it. Just to underscore this point, there has been a lot of talk throughout the forum about the 2% target for NATO and whether that needs to increase to 3%. I think that this construct, this percentage of GDP construct, is a political construct. It is a useful metric of political will, but it is only the beginning of a process of actually building an effective military. I mean, countries have to have the ability to actually absorb a budget. If a national legislation increases the military budget, that's very useful, but that doesn't magically produce a military overnight. The best time to have begun this process of rebuilding Europe's militaries would have been in 2014, after the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine. Didn't happen. The second best time to do it would be this afternoon. Similarly, the US military and the other American national security structures are reorienting towards the Russian threat, the Chinese threat, after many years of focusing on counterinsurgency. And I think this is useful, and it's a process that can only be carried out in conjunction with our allies. The third point I want to make is I'm going to use a word that I've heard very little at the forum, which is optimism. President Franklin Roosevelt was famous for saying at the beginning of the Great Depression, and then again when the United States entered World War II, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. There is a significant Russian military threat to Europe. The Russian military has capability, it has mass. We have enormous capabilities of our own if we have the political will to use them for deterrence and, if need be, in the defense of Europe. We have enormous technological advantages over the Russians still. It is possible for precision to defeat mass. I am not saying that if the nightmare came true that NATO was in conflict with Russia, that it would be easy. It is not something we welcome, and I assure you nobody in the American national security structures is looking for war with Russia. But if it happens, we have strengths of our own. And just to give one example, the fact that Sweden and Finland have now joined the alliance greatly complicates Putin's strategic challenges. So I don't think we should despair. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Now I'm going to Șerban, Lucian, Lungu, and I wanted to touch upon more specific issues, and especially since you are representing Romania, your country. I would like to ask how much the war in Ukraine has affected your planning for the future, and secondly, while you were planning, if you faced dilemmas about where to buy from the US or some EU industry, and if that was somehow a political problem for your country.
Thank you very much for a very interesting question, and I want to share with you the honored to being invited to address such a distinguished audience. I should first share with you that for us the clarion call sounded very clear precisely 10 years ago with the illegal annexation of Crimea. So we had the political pact becoming effective in 2017, signed by all political parliamentary parties to provide 2%, out of which 20% for major equipment. For defense, it's still in place. It has increased to 2.5. And on that ground, we have started to invest in state-of-the-art capabilities, which we believed were fit for purpose for what happened on, and is still happening on our eastern border. That is Patriot, HIMARS, coastal defense by NSM, Piranha 5, the later to be produced in Romania. We had already a F-16 program underway as a transition to F-35. We have a whole-of-government approach, mainly with the Ministry of Economy, in order to provide security of supply for defense. By that I mean two issues: to have timely access to equipment and the ability to support it in-house. We have legislation to cover that. It was amended last December to cover government to government as well, because our plan is to have at least life cycle support of the equipment that is maintains, repair and overhaul. But the goal is to have as much integration in the national defense industry as possible of any system we buy. Related to political issues, this was a great question. Our defense policy, and this is trans-party, so it's across the aisle, it was never contested, relies on, it's reflected in our national planning documents at national and department level, rests on three pillars: our membership to NATO, our membership to EU, and our strategic partnership with the US, which was signed in 1997, and I dare say has withstood the test of time. It is in our DNA to say that to such tall challenges, the answers should be jointly by the democracies on both sides of the Atlantic. So it is fit for what I've said, that we employ all tools in the box. Commercial, government to government, mainly FMS, but not only, contracts under NSPA, common procurement. We will have one with, I cannot disclose more details, but it is in line with the EU policy and that. As far as NSPA goes, I want to cite a very successful recent example of transatlantic cooperation. NSPA has awarded, on behalf of a European initiative, that is the European Sky Shield initiative led by Germany, a contract for PAC-2 missiles for Patriot to be manufactured in Europe in order to alleviate pressure on the original equipment manufacturer. We have several tenders open, but one I would want to draw attention to it is one we have for 155 self-propelled howitzers. It is closest to signature. Aside the actual integration industry of the platform themselves, one topic which was several times alluded for was the integration in our industry of the 155 ammunition, which is a critical topic for Ukraine defense against Russians. And again, here it seems that mass beats precision. We have a project by our state-owned defense industry with Rheinmetall to build a gunpowder factory, which will benefit for a 47 million grant for the European Commission. Our procurement system has three main goals: highest degree of interoperability with NATO, as I mentioned several times, integration defense industry, and time. Time is of the essence, it's rewarded in our procurements. As far as fragmentation, I won't speak to that, because I'm a different position. I represent the one who operates the systems, not the one who manufactures that. We are fully aware that higher degree of industrial participation comes with a price tag. It's foolish to believe that it's cost neutral. It isn't. But we are willing to take that extra mile because we are a potential frontline nation. it will be difficult to imagine pushing back equipment for maintained. We would rather have the ability to do it on our own territory. It might benefit allies. And I would say for ships, for instance, it would be well nigh impossible to take them out of the Black Sea, send them Mediterranean or elsewhere to have them repaired. So in these times, a fine balance between effectiveness and efficiency is harder to achieve than any time before. We would rather err on the side of effectiveness, having a spare capacity in the long run. That bridge will be crossed when we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Șerban. Now we'll switch to Greek. Στρατηγέ, κύριε Στεφανή, θα θέλαμε να μας αναπτύξετε από τη μακρόχρονη εμπειρία σας και στις ένοπλες δυνάμεις και βεβαίως μετά ως επικεφαλής του Υπουργείου Άμυνας σε διάφορες θέσεις. Ποιες είναι οι προκλήσεις που πρέπει να αντιμετωπίσει μια χώρα μεσαίου μεγέθους για τα ευρωπαϊκά δεδομένα όπως η Ελλάδα στην προσπάθεια να μπει να μπει στην κοινή αμυντική πολιτική της Ευρώπης και να μπορέσει να παραγάγει και πράγματα. Είναι δυνατόν αυτό? Οι βιομηχανίες μας είναι μικρές σε σχέση με όλη αυτή τη συζήτηση που έχουμε κάνει αυτή τη στιγμή.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Την καλημέρα μου σε όλες και όλους. Thank you very much for being with us today. Θα ξεκινήσω από το εξής. Τις τελευταίες μέρες παρακολούθησα πάρα πολλές συνεδρίες στο φόρουμ. Συνεδρίες που είχαν σχέση με οικονομικά, με πολιτιστικά, με τη θρησκεία, με την πρόοδο, με την εκπαίδευση. Κυρίαρχη λέξη παντού ήταν μία. Η ανάγκη για ασφάλεια. Άρα λοιπόν πρέπει να συνειδητοποιήσουμε ότι ο φόβος έχει επιστρέψει στον κόσμο, έχει επιστρέψει στην Ευρώπη, ειδικά έχει επιστρέψει σε αυτή την ιδιαίτερη περιοχή που ζούμε εμείς. Δεν πρέπει να ξεχνάμε ότι στο ανατολικό μας τόξο μένεται ο πόλεμος στην Ουκρανία, συμβαίνει ο πόλεμος αυτή τη στιγμή στην περιοχή της Γάζας και χθες το βράδυ ολοκληρώσαμε τη μέρα μας όλοι, διαβάζοντας στις ειδήσεις την απειλή του Ιράν να επιτεθεί στο Ισραήλ. Και ξυπνήσαμε σήμερα το πρωί αναζητώντας σε εφημερίδες μήπως έχει συμβεί κάτι. Άρα λοιπόν βλέπουμε ότι αντί η κατάσταση να περιορίζεται, η κατάσταση χειροτερεύει. Και αν κάνουμε ένα άλμα στο παρελθόν και δούμε ποιοι είναι οι λόγοι που έγινε το ΝΑΤΟ, η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση και ο Οργανισμός Ηνωμένων Εθνών τη δεκαετία τέλος 40, αρχές 50, ήταν ο φόβος. Ο φόβος επανέρχεται αυτή τη στιγμή. Και ο φόβος μας κάνει να αναζητούμε λύσεις. Και ο φόβος μας κάνει να αντιληφθούμε ότι πλέον οι προκλήσεις έχουν αλλάξει. Υπάρχει ένα παλιό ρητό που λέει δεν είναι δυνατόν να εκτελέσεις, να υλοποιήσεις επιτυχώς ένα πόλεμο που έρχεται με λογικές συνθήκες και συνήθειες του παρελθόντος. Κυρίαρχο λοιπόν στην εποχή μας είναι να αλλάξουμε τον τρόπο με τον οποίο σκεφτόμαστε. Πρέπει να αλλάξει το mindset μας, έτσι ώστε να μπορέσουμε να αντιμετωπίσουμε τις προκλήσεις που έρχονται. Ακούω πολλές συζητήσεις για ευρωπαϊκό στρατό. Ακούω πολλές συζητήσεις για την έλλειψη αυτού του ευρωπαϊκού στρατού. Αν είμαστε ειλικρινείς και μιλάμε ειλικρινά προς τον κόσμο, δεν πρόκειται ποτέ να υπάρξει ευρωπαϊκό στρατός, όπως δεν υπάρχει και νατοϊκό στρατός. Ποιοι είναι οι στρατοί που δημιουργούνται? Οι οργανισμοί εκμεταλλεύονται τις στρατηγικές δυνατότητες των χωρών, δημιουργούν ένα tailored στράτευμα και αυτό το tailored στράτευμα πάει να αντιμετωπίσει τις προκλήσεις. Τι γίνεται τώρα κάτω στην Ερυθρά Θάλασσα? Οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες, η Μεγάλη Βρετανία και η Ελλάδα παρέχουν δυνάμεις για να προστατευτούν τα εμπορικά πλοία. Άρα λοιπόν έτσι θα συνεχίσουμε να λειτουργούμε. Μπορεί να γίνει αυτό καλύτερα? Βεβαίως και μπορεί να γίνει καλύτερα. Επί σειρά ετών η Ευρώπη έχει αφήσει την αμυντική της λειτουργία στο ΝΑΤΟ. Και βλέπουμε ένα κρίσιμο ερώτημα είναι αυτή τη στιγμή, στο πλαίσιο της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης δεν υπάρχει ΣΑΚΕΡ, δεν υπάρχει ΣΕΙΠ, δεν υπάρχει δηλαδή ο ανώτατος στρατηγικός διοικητής όπως υπάρχει στο ΝΑΤΟ. Και είναι κάτι που πρέπει να γίνει. Είδατε τώρα τις τελευταίες συζητήσεις και μάλιστα ήταν η εισήγηση του Έλληνα Πρωθυπουργού να υπάρξει επίτροπος άμυνας στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Ένας υπουργός άμυνας της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, ο οποίος να μπορεί να υλοποιήσει τις αποφάσεις της αμυντικής εξωτερικής πολιτικής. Είναι ένα πρώτο βήμα αυτό? Βεβαίως και είναι πρώτο βήμα. Παράλληλα όμως δεν πρέπει να πούμε ότι δεν γίνεται και τίποτα. Γίνονται πάρα πολλά πράγματα. Αυτή τη στιγμή τα περιέγραψε ο εκπρόσωπος της Lockheed, υπάρχουν εξαιρετικές συνεργασίες. Ας πάρουμε το F-35. Το F-35, εκτός από τις ΗΠΑ, παρασκευάζεται και σε πάρα πολλές άλλες χώρες. Να πάρουμε το C-130, στο οποίο συμμετέχουμε και εμείς στην παραγωγή αυτή τη στιγμή, η Ελλάδα. Να πάρουμε το F-16, στο οποίο, παίρνοντας τα φώτα από τη Lockheed, κάνουμε την αναβάθμιση αυτή τη στιγμή εδώ στην Ελλάδα. Και αυτό συμβαίνει όχι μόνο στην Ελλάδα, και στις υπόλοιπες χώρες. Άρα έχουμε το μοντέλο, έχουμε το παράδειγμα για να κάνουμε καλύτερα τα πράγματα. Τι χρειάζεται να γίνει? Πρέπει να αντιληφθούμε ότι έπρεπε εχθές να έχουμε προχωρήσει σε αυτό το βήμα και πρέπει αυτό το βήμα να το κάνουμε. Κάποια στιγμή ήδη τα μηνύματα τα πήραμε από τις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες πριν μία τριετία, όταν οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες αλλάξανε τη στρατηγική τους με το περίφημο πρόγραμμα Swift to Asia και αποφασίσανε να μετακινήσουν το στρατηγικό τους ενδιαφέρον από την Ευρώπη στην Ασία. Μάλιστα βγήκε και το περίφημο δόγμα του Ben Hodges, του φίλου μου στρατηγού διοικητή, ο οποίος είπε πως 30.000 Αμερικάνοι άνδρες στην Ευρώπη θα μπορούσαν να κάνουν τη δουλειά 300.000 Αμερικάνων ανδρών στην Ευρώπη. Άρα υπάρχουν λογικές και έχουμε πάρει τα μηνύματα. Τι χρειάζεται? Χρειάζεται να αντιληφθούμε ότι οι προκλήσεις είναι κοινές, χρειάζεται να αντιληφθούμε ότι έχουμε λύσεις κοινές και χρειάζεται πραγματικά να αντιληφθούμε ότι έχουμε τεράστιες δυνατότητες στο αμυντικό μας σύστημα. Δυνατότητες οι οποίες μπορούν να ξεπεράσουν κάθε πρόκληση που υπάρχει ή θα υπάρξει. Βάζω εδώ μια ανωτελεία και θα επανέλθω.
Of course. Jonathan, I'm getting back to you. You already alluded to the need of cooperation between the so-called giants and the small guys in the industry. So I wanted to know if, companies such as Lockheed Martin could play a role in enhancing cooperation with startups, for example. Is that a way of work for you?
Yes, it is. And we already do an extensive amount of that. We seek globally the best skills that we can find for the challenges that we see on the horizon. So, where can we find research in teams who have skill sets that are going to solve the problems of tomorrow? We have recently signed in Romania with the University of Cluj for some work on AI, because we see that university as having expertise in that area, so we're working with them. That may well result in spin-off companies coming out of that. So even before the SME companies, we're working with universities to try and develop the technology where they will own the IP, not us, not the big giant Lockheed. The IP will reside with the university that they can then take to Romanian industry or wider European industry and spin out from there. I can give plenty of examples of that around the world, but we are very focused on the fact that the challenges of tomorrow will be solved in the research institutes of today and not just in the United States.
Okay. Philip, I'll try to touch upon something we've discussed a bit earlier. Everyone says that it's not only about weaponry, it's not about capabilities, it's also about volume. And I would also wanted to ask you if it's also about, the commitment from the population and supporting such policies. I think that, strategic historians note that, for example, the Franco-Prussian War is an amazing example where you had two competitive technologies. No one was more sophisticated than the other. Nonetheless, the war was judged because the one side was more committed to it in terms of population and society and everything. So do you think that, the West, let's say in broader terms, the US and the European Union is, has realized that, it has to be a bit more, how can I say it, present in how the policies for defense and security are being designed in from their respective governments nowadays?
Mm-hmm. I think that's right, that national will is critical to determining whether or not governments are able to act in their own defense and in the defense of their allies. And I think it's unquestionable that in the United States, the failure in Afghanistan, the failure in Iraq, if you look at the original U.S. goals for Iraq in 2003, has led to an increase in isolationism in the U.S. But it's not, in my view, it's not so much that, that a significant number of Americans want to disengage from the world, but they need a clear understanding of the costs and benefits of it. And I think that that Putin was probably quite surprised that the U.S. provided the leadership that it did in conjunction with our European partners in 2022. He didn't expect that. And I think that shows how Americans will respond to threats when they understand them. And if we end up in a situation where Russia is actually invading partner countries like the Baltics or Poland, I think that most Americans, including those who may, who may express isolationist views now, will very rapidly come to recognize that an attack on Europe is an attack on the United States. And I can't speak as well as others here about European attitudes, but it seems to me that there has been significant change, an awakening, if you will, since the 2022 resumption of Russian aggression in Ukraine, that the threats that we thought were something of the past still exist.
Yes, Jonathan.
Can I just add to that? I've been in this defense and security business for over 40 years now. For the first 35 years of that, if you told me that Germany was going to be spending what it's now planning to spend with its 100 billion euro fund on defense, I would have first been astonished and secondly probably worried. Now, of course, to your point that attitudes have shifted, we are welcoming that and we are pushing Germany as the biggest economic driver in Europe to do more. And so I think there has been a sea change in approach in the last few years.
Thank you.
May I?
Yes, of course.
Θέλω να προσθέσω κάτι σε αυτό το εξαιρετικό το οποίο είπατε. Βρισκόμαστε αυτή τη στιγμή στην 4η γενιά του πολέμου, που αυτό σημαίνει στην εξέλιξη του πολέμου ότι πλέον το σύνολο ενός έθνους πρέπει να συμμετέχει για την υλοποίηση των στόχων. Και γι' αυτό βλέπουμε μία μετακίνηση από το National Defense Strategy στο National Security Strategy. Φύγαμε λοιπόν από την άμυνα και πήγαμε στην ασφάλεια, που η ασφάλεια είναι ένας όρος που τα εμπεριέχει όλα μέσα. Και είδαμε και τους στρατηγικούς στόχους του Πούτιν. Ο Πούτιν δεν στόχευσε εχθρικές μεραρχίες, στόχευσε τη διοίκηση στο Κίεβο με σκοπό να αλλάξει τον πρόεδρο του Κιέβου. Το ίδιο κάνουν και κάτω στο Ισραήλ η Χαμάς. Άρα λοιπόν πρέπει να είμαστε προετοιμασμένοι γι' αυτό. Αυτό που είπατε για το national will είναι ίσως το σημαντικότερο και η Ελλάδα έχει αποδείξει ότι το έχει αντιληφθεί αυτό. Διότι τα τελευταία χρόνια εμείς πλέον συμμετέχουμε ενεργά με τις ενοπλές μας δυνάμεις σε όλες τις επιχειρήσεις που γίνονται στο εξωτερικό και στην Ουκρανία και σε κάθε επιχείρηση του ΝΑΤΟ και της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Δείχνουμε τα τελευταία 4 χρόνια μια τεράστια αλλαγή στον τρόπο που αντιλαμβανόμαστε το διεθνές πεδίο ασφάλειας. Ευχαριστώ.
Mr. Lungu, I'd like to go back to you. Everyone has touched upon the issue of not only weaponry and technology, but also on tactics also. How, and of course, hybrid the threats and etc. Has your country, changed its strategy towards that direction as well? Because I think that especially in the initial stages of the warfare in Ukraine, there have been significant fears in Romania that it could be a target of hybrid attacks against the infrastructure and cyber attacks and so on.
Thank you for the question. Aside the fact that I've mentioned 2018 and 2014, excuse me, and the funding for defense, I think Romania is the first nation to mention in 2020 in our national defense strategy, which is a misnomer. It's basically a national security strategy, but it is called as such. Russia as a threat to Romania's security. So of course, taking a fig leaf of what happened in Crimea, hybrid warfare was a line of effort, or countering, of course, as a whole of government, both military, but in a support role, rather the security institution of the state. So this is an area where, of course, what is ongoing every day. We see it in the media. We know who is behind. There is a lot of activity, and we're trying to counter that because I think the first line, of course, is Ukraine. Then it's Moldova, which is under the brunt of Russia's hybrid warfare, but we are not spared of it either. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan, I'd like to get back to you and ask, sometimes we claim that big industries are difficult to move. So I wanted to adjust, and I wanted to ask you if you, if you've worked on the lessons learned from the Ukrainian warfare, but also what's happening right now in Gaza and the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, to, let's say, differentiate a little bit your portfolio or improve it.
Thank you for the implied criticism. Yes, Lockheed is a corporation of 120,000 people, so any major shift in direction is not a straightforward piece. But we do set ourselves up in such a way that we have specialist teams led by senior research fellows in particular fields who run small teams relative to the size of the company, who have the authority and the wherewithal to pursue particular issues. We gather intelligence from what we're seeing to try and predict what the next challenges are going to be. So yes, whilst we've also used our own investment money to ramp up production in Javelin and HIMARS and PAC-3 missiles, we are also ploughing money into pure research within the corporation. The Skunk Works obviously is perhaps the most famous example of that with the technologies that have come out of there. We are continuing to drive that work forward in collaboration with industrial partners and other governments so that we're ready for the challenges of tomorrow.
Allow me to follow up on this. What exactly do I mean is that, companies such as Lockheed Martin build airplanes, helicopters, ships, big stuff. But in the last wars, we've seen that UAVs, very cheap pieces of weaponry, can, if not change the course of the war, certainly change how war is fought on the actual battlefield. So that was pretty much the target of my question.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing, particularly in Ukraine, is an evolution of using commercial technology. A lot of these drones have come out of the commercial side, where rapid, fast production, I think is critical. I think the approach of the Ukrainian armed forces to the fact that they are happy to launch 100 drones and have 90 of them knocked down, as long as 10 get through, that's victory. That's a change of mindset for our military customers. We are used to more static thinking and therefore exquisite, precise solutions. And I think we are seeing, and we are in discussion with many of our partners, allies, military, as to how do we adapt, do we encourage our suppliers to adapt to the lessons that are coming out from there.
Thank you, Philip. I'd like to get back to you on the transatlantic bond and how it's been tested. The challenge is not straightforward. Of course, everyone recognizes Russian aggression as a certain challenge for the European Union and the Western institutions in general. But there are also, divergences about, the actual targets. What are the actual problems of the West? So, I'm also trying to say here that, Greece has had its issues with Turkey in the previous years. this was a challenge that could not be addressed in a straightforward way. So I wanted to ask you if you believe that the cohesion of NATO is a given fact even within its own within NATO.
I'm an optimist about the future of NATO in that regard. I think that it is natural that individual countries have their own individual national interests, and some are quite transactional in the way they approach that. I mean, in the case of Turkey, there are observers in America, frequently in Congress, who become outraged when Turkish views diverge from ours, and they say, well, Turkey's a NATO ally, it should just, follow NATO policy, which is a euphemism for Turkey should do as it's told. That is not realistic. We shouldn't expect any of our allies or partners just to blindly follow whatever the current leadership is from Washington, or for Brussels for that matter. So I think we need to be dispassionate about that and understand that countries have national interests. That doesn't mean that we give in all the time, but that we do business. I mean, an example here is I don't think anyone who has worked with Turkey was surprised when the Erdogan government wanted to exact a price for allowing Finland and Sweden into the alliance, okay? You can be outraged about that, but you shouldn't be surprised. And in the end, they exacted something of a price from Sweden, from Finland, from the United States, from others. And when they had exacted the payment that they could receive, they permitted it. Okay, we can do business that way. The NATO has been successful for decades, and I think it will continue to be successful. It's up to the people of Europe through their democratically elected governments to decide how much energy to put into the so-called European army, EU military structures. It's not up to us. Whether the energy goes into NATO or goes into Europe is secondary to the question of how much energy, how much money, how much manpower, how much national will European countries are going to put into their own defense. And the final point I'd make here is that while some American politicians are more direct, sometimes even abrasive, in discussing their desire to see Europe do more, that is pretty much a consensus view across the American political establishment and among American citizens, that the U.S. can do a great deal to protect our allies and partners, but we expect them to do more as well. So again, this gets back to my earlier point that whether a Democrat or Republican is in the White House, whatever the nature of America's Congress, there's an expectation that Europe will do more.
Thank you. Șerban, something last from you as well. It's quite known here in Greece, but I'd like to share it with our international audience. There is that corridor starting from Alexandroupolis all the way up to the eastern flank of NATO alliance. It has been proved crucial for keeping the cohesion of NATO from the eastern flank, and also to move weapons and ammunition to Ukraine as well. What's the Romanian perspective for that?
Well, it is our policy, and I cannot diverge for that, that we are stating and doing as much as humanly possible to support Ukraine in all dimensions, humanitarian, grain, and military, but we do not go to great detail on the actual things we do on that one.
Thank you. Thank you. Στρατηγέ Στεφανή, κλείνουμε με εσάς. Ήθελα να μου πείτε, έτσι, ο κύριος Κόσνετ είπε ότι είναι αισιόδοξο, εγώ είμαι απεσιόδοξο για την ελληνική αμυντική βιομηχανία, και ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω αν πιστεύω ότι τα επόμενα χρόνια μπορεί πράγματι η ελληνική αμυντική βιομηχανία να επιστρέψει ξανά να μπορεί να κατασκευάσει κάτι, τέλος πάντων, δικό της.
Before that, half an hour ago, I mentioned General Hodges, and I realized that Ben is with us here. Welcome, my friend. Welcome. Very nice to see you. Πριν πάω σε αυτό, και σας ευχαριστώ για την ερώτηση, θα ήθελα να πω κάτι σε σχέση με αυτό που συζητήσαμε πριν για τα UAVs και την προσπάθεια η οποία γίνεται κλπ. Ξέρετε, όταν επιχειρησιακά οι ένοπλες δυνάμεις μιας χώρας, θέλοντας να εκπληρώσουν την εθνική στρατιωτική στρατηγική, φτάσουν στο σημείο να συζητάνε για κατοχή εχθρικού εδάφους, τότε φεύγουμε πολύ από τα UAVs και πάμε στις παραδοσιακές μορφές του πολέμου. Βλέπετε τη συζήτηση η οποία ξεκίνησε τώρα τελευταία για τα άρματα μάχης, από τα οποία προέρχομαι, από αυτόν τον κλάδο. Και αν πρέπει να υπάρχουν ή δεν πρέπει. Και επανήλθαμε στο ότι η Γερμανία σκέφτεται να ξεκινήσει ξανά τη γραμμή παραγωγής των Leopard, έτσι ώστε να εφοδιάσει τις χώρες που τα έχουν ανάγκη. Είναι μια μεγάλη συζήτηση λοιπόν πώς βλέπουμε το μέλλον των ενόπλων δυνάμεων. Ένα δεύτερο θέμα που ήθελα να πω και αφορά τη Lockheed Martin. Γνωρίζετε όλοι ότι πλέον η Ελλάδα έχει τη χαρά και την τύχη και την τιμή να είναι μέρος του προγράμματος των F-35. Αυτό οδηγεί τις ένοπλες δυνάμεις της χώρας μας σε μια νέα εποχή. Διότι το F-35 δεν είναι ένα αεροσκάφος, είναι μια πλατφόρμα η οποία θα μας βοηθήσει να πάμε στο μέλλον. Μαζί λοιπόν με την υπόλοιπη αεροπορία μας που αναβαθμίζεται, πραγματικά μιλάμε για μία από τις καλύτερες αεροπορίες στον κόσμο και αυτό είναι από μόνο του ένα πολύ θετικό και αισιόδοξο μήνυμα. Τώρα, εάν θα τα καταφέρει, έρχομαι στο ερώτημά σας, η ελληνική αμυντική βιομηχανία να προχωρήσει, πιστεύω πως ναι. Διάβασα το σχέδιο του Υπουργείου, το τελευταίο του κυρίου Δένδια, και είδα πάρα πολύ χρήσιμα στοιχεία. Βλέπω και τα στελέχη που είναι εδώ ανάμεσά μας, που είναι από αυτό τον επιτελικό φορέα, ο οποίος θα ανιχνεύει τις ανάγκες, θα συζητά με το κέντρο καινοτομίας και από εκεί μέσα θα προέρχονται οι λύσεις. Είναι λοιπόν, πιστεύω, ένα πολύ ενθαρρυντικό βήμα για το μέλλον και ναι, μπορώ να πω ότι είμαι φύση και θέση αισιόδοξος.
Thank you very much for keeping the time. Thank you all for listening to us, and don't leave. We will be having another discussion right away with Mr. Dani Yatom. Thank you.